Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 28th of April, 2025, and we are here to present to you a live stream on a very specific subject, at least to start off with, which is on the subject of former Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte and his recent arrest by the what I would call the entirely fake International Criminal Court, a body which is a product of US imperialism, but of course, US imperialism would never sign up to be governed by the rules that they insist others should be held to. So, we're going to be getting to that in just a moment. Now, we are here in the process of creating a studio. We are currently in front of the newly installed green screen. Shall we say, fancy projected backgrounds to follow in future episodes. So, we are going to be talking tonight about the recent arrest of Duterte and what this means. Now, to understand this, we'll have to be looking a little bit at Filipino history and also, more specifically, the role of US imperialism in Filipino history. Now, we're just going to do some quick greetings in the chat before we get going. So hello to David Ball, T.G. Wilson, Mo1917, Comrade Jawad, Comrade Lee, Agricola, Sid Hatfield, President Jesus, and Caustic Grip in the YouTube chat. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. Subscribe to the various channels. We are live on YouTube, Rumble, Locals, Twitch, and X. So, to begin this by talking about what has actually happened. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with who Rodrigo Duterte is, Duterte was president of the Philippines for one term up to 2021. Before that, he was a very well-known local Filipino politician who came out of the Davao city of Davao in the Philippines, where he was, by all accounts, a very successful mayor. And the reason for his indictment is stated as being his usage of what you might call extrajudicial executions, death squads, basically, to try and solve what he referred to as the Philippines' huge drug problem. And the Philippines does have a drug problem, and it does have does have a crime problem stemming or circulating around issues related to drug dealing, drug taking, etc. There is a lot of crime in the Philippines. There is an awful lot of poverty in the Philippines. So Duterte, as the man who made his name in the city of Davao, which is, again, a major city there, though, of course, most of us have probably never heard of it. In fact, before I started writing about the subject, I certainly never had. But Davao used to be a very crime-ridden, very violent place, and by all accounts, Duterte turned it around, which was the base, turned it around to a certain extent, meaning that there was less street crime, the level of business investment in the area went up. There was a more general feeling of orderliness that he introduced. And this was the basis upon which he became quite popular, and the basis upon which he ran for the presidency all the way back in 2015-16. So, interesting that he will be charged with crimes going all the way back to his time in Davao, which is what the International Criminal Court's indictment stated. They accused him of killing at least 7,000 people using essentially death squad methods to do so. Now, there's no doubt that Duterte is what you might call a dubious character. He's a bourgeois politician who had obvious Bonapartist tendencies, but couldn't quite pull off a full-blown Bonapartist regime in the Philippines, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But the point about why he has been indicted has nothing to do, really, with running a death squad. The US and those who really run the International Criminal Court, those who set it up, the imperialist powers, have no objections to death squads as long as they are their death squads. They have no real objection to to extrajudicial violence as long as it's done for their purposes. I mean, bear in mind, the imperialists had no problem with multiple comprador presidents of Colombia running death squads. This is a standard piece of imperialist politics. The problem that they have with Duterte isn't anything to do with death squads. It isn't anything to do with using violent methods to clamp down upon the drug trade. It's everything to do, and ultimately more to do with the relationship he tried to forge with China, or more specifically and more precisely with the attempt by Duterte to steer a path between China and U.S. imperialism. And to understand why this was so fatal to him, we need to look at the relationship between the Philippines and U.S. imperialism. Now, the Philippines, if you don't know, was a long-time Spanish colony. In fact, for over 300 years, the Philippines were a big part of the Spanish Empire. They remained part of the Spanish Empire for almost, for 80 years almost, after the revolt of the South American nations that saw Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, etc., Ecuador, become independent over the course of the early to late 1820s. And the rise of the nationalist movements in the Philippines was very much inspired by the breakaway of the South American nations from Spain, albeit in the Philippines this came later. So there was, in the later 19th century, a nationalist movement begins in the Philippines. So from around about the 1870s, it becomes a major movement in the 1890s. In 1892, the first major Filipino revolutionary organization was founded. This was known as the Katipunan and was headed by, amongst others, Andres Bonifacio. And he would be the first, albeit very short-lived, president of an independent Filipino republic. Now, they built the Filipino nationalists built up towards being able to stage a revolt, and this revolt breaks out into the open in 1896, which saw a then 2-year war waged against the Spanish colonialists, a war which the US inserted itself into, claiming to be on the side of the Filipinos, just as at the same time, and this is the time of the Spanish-American War in 1898, they claimed to be on the side of the Cubans. So many in the Filipino revolutionary movement saw themselves as being in league with the US, in line with the US, and that the US was assisting them in gaining their freedom from the Spanish, just as some in Cuba thought that. They, of course, were betrayed because this was a maneuver by the US, trading on its reputation as having escaped the colonial domination of the British, and still having some, shall we say, credo in the in revolutionary circles by the end of the 19th century. The revolutionaries in the Philippines initially saw them as allies, but quickly worked out when the US purchased the Philippines from the Spanish under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, where apparently the US paid the Spanish $20 million in return for gaining control over the Philippines. Now, this saw the US then attempt to impose direct rule over the country. And this led to a long and brutal war, which saw US imperialism kill many thousands and saw at least 200,000 Filipinos die as a result of that war through direct combat, massacres, and also hunger, disease, etc., the all conditions of which were worsened by the war. So the US then tried to institute their own version of colonial rule, never really managed to do it for a long, sustained period of time. The Filipino resistance continued, albeit on a smaller scale. They were thrown out of the islands briefly by the Japanese in 1942 to the infamous moment when MacArthur was forced to retreat from the Philippines and then staged his re-entry in a dramatic fashion. But the US was unable to restore direct occupation or neocolonial, or I would say colonial rule after 1945, so they put in a neocolonial regime in 1946, which nominally restored Filipino sovereignty, which had never really existed except as a brief flurry when the initial independence movement gained some control over the islands in the period between the Spanish being defeated and the Americans moving in. So from 1946, nominally speaking, the Philippines becomes independent. But the US imperialists maintained extensive military control over the Filipino government. They did a full-blown neo-colonial maneuvering to gain control over this nominally independent country, meaning that they retained tight control over the bureaucracy, over the military hierarchy, over law enforcement. And the Filipino military to this day is trained and armed and heavily under the influence of US imperialism. If you look at all the equipment the Filipino Army and Navy and Air Force use, the great bulk of it is from the United States. The officer corps of the Filipino Armed Forces all do their training in the United States. Some do it in Europe or Britain, but mostly it's in military colleges in the United States. So this is an army which is trained and built for domestic repression, because that's what the only way the US builds up an army that's in one of its neo-colonial possessions, which is what the Philippines basically is. They only build it up if it's going to be used for internal repression. It's useless fighting external wars. It's like if you look back at like the way they built up that Iraqi army or that Afghan army in the times of the occupations there in those countries, those were only ever any good at internal repression. They weren't any good at fighting actual battles. That's the story of all the US proxies. So they built this up, the Filipino military, in order that it can be a tool in their hands. Now, they were the primary backers of the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Currently, we have the democratic rule of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. More on him later. But Marcos ruled for over 20 years, from 1965 to 1986, often by a martial law, and also during that time made sure that he plunged the government of the Philippines into ever greater amounts of debt to the International Monetary Fund and other international lenders. Again, same story everywhere you look. The US and its advisors tell their puppet regimes, well, we really think you ought to look at taking out some loans. Why? Well, because enforcement of the will of the United States is easier to do if you control the debt of the country concerned. It's the reason why Moreno, the arch traitor in Ecuador, took out $4 billion worth of IMF loans, despite the fact that they really didn't need to do it. The IMF loans are not there to help with development. They're not there to help build up the economy. They are given in order that the nation can become indebted. This is the only reason why they are given. And this is the way in which the Filipino government was constrained and brought into very tight, even tighter control by the US during the Marcos period. The Marcos period ends in a popular revolt in 1986. Marcos is forced to flee. He runs over to Hawaii and lives out the rest of his days there. What followed Marcos was a succession of various presidents and governments that were to varying degrees ineffective. There's been and remains long-term revolts by various Islamic groups in the Philippines, particularly in the south, I think, but also the long-term Filipino Maoist rebellion is one of the longest-running armed insurgencies in the world, that and the Naxalites in India. So this is a country with an awful lot of problems. The primary one, though, is that it is the role of the United States. The role of the United States in the Philippines has been wholly destructive all the way since US imperialism first imposed itself on the Philippines back in 1898. The aim is to control not just the industry and agriculture of the Philippines, though that is a big part of it, but the strategic position that the Philippines has makes it even more valuable for US imperialism than the question of whatever labor can be exploited or natural resources can be exploited there. If you look on a map to see where the Philippines is, you can see that it's a country that is, again, very important strategic position next to, well, very within striking distance of China, within striking distance of course, Taiwan, of Vietnam, of of Malaysia, and all the waterways that the Chinese use to export their manufactured goods. So the idea that the US was ever going to just, agree to a government in the Philippines taking a sort of neutral approach or an even-handed approach between the Chinese and the US, that was never going to happen. And this, again, is Duterte's principal sin. And of course, the Philippines has various territorial disputes with its neighbors and has some with the Chinese, particularly over the Spratly Islands and the area known as the Scarborough Shoal. Very small places, but again, you control them. This gives you a certain degree of control over shipping lanes as well. When containing China or trying to contain China is really what this is mostly all about. So we come then to Duterte himself. Now, Duterte, as I said, rose to the presidency after having a successful career in regional politics, principally as mayor of the city of Davao. He held office there repeatedly as mayor from 1988 through to when he ran for the presidency in 2016. During a period of his mayoralty in Davao, Duterte is credited with successfully reducing street crime and violence that stemmed from a lot of the open political warfare that took place during the late Marcos period. He's also credited locally with successfully reducing drug-related street crime. And this is where the war on drugs thing comes from. And this is where some of the allegations used against him in the ICC indictment come from. It's alleged that he licensed the policy to carry out executions of drug users and petty criminals, and that he ran an off-the-books death squad, basically. Now, given that Duterte has boasted about doing this sometimes, or rather, and then offered some kind of strange admissions, excuse me, at other times, it's clear that he used very violent tactics to pursue his ends when it comes to the war on drugs. No doubt about that. It's also acknowledged even by his enemies that these tactics worked, at least for a time. And we'll come on to the tactics in just a moment. But this is what he brought to the presidency and how he chose to tackle the problem. And I believe that Duterte, he clearly is a Bonapartist. He clearly has, his politics are an odd sort of grab bag of like some of them, some nationalistic positions. Some positions are a little bit more what you might call on the comprador side. Basically, Duterte seemed to be about navigating his way between the different clans in Filipino politics and also the different large international powers, particularly the US imperialists and the Chinese, which the Philippines find itself caught between. So, the question of the drug war is one that is quite interesting because various bourgeois politicians over the last 50 to 60 years have declared various wars on drugs. Now, when it came to, for instance, the Felipe Calderon in Mexico, his war on drugs was quite evidently some kind of fraud, given that it had no impact whatsoever on actual drug consumption or the selling of drugs. But it did kill an awful lot of people, and it did destabilize the Mexican state, and maybe that's what the US was actually after. Now, when it comes to the Philippines, Duterte and his policies were abandoned by the returning Marcos clan, personified by, of course, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And this then saw a rise again in drug-related crimes, according to statistics from the Filipino government. So Duterte's tactics seem to have worked statistically speaking. Now, one can argue about like the ethics of this or the morality of this, but the whole question of like whether this is effective or not needs to be, well, we need to widen our lens for this analysis to see when capitalist politicians and bourgeois politicians like Duterte try and do crackdowns on drug usage. What they usually do is exactly what Duterte did. They use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. They round people up, kill people, throw people in prison. Now, sometimes, as with Duterte, this can have an impact if you line up all the drug dealers and fucking shoot a load of them. Well, then that can have a bit of an impact. It certainly would put the fear of God into some. If you line up all the drug dealers, arrest them all, and throw them in prison. If you adopt so-called zero tolerance policies on drugs, it can have an impact. But it's not an impact that lasts. What you usually find is that the drug purchasing and consumption will go down for a while, then it will rise back up again. Because even if you're doing like very violent crackdowns and are killing a lot of people, you're still not addressing the problem as to why people in any country or any locality might take narcotics. People take narcotics because, if we look at the statistics in the Philippines, you have at least 10% of the population living in dire poverty and 58% of the population being defined as low income. Right, so that means there's a total of at least 32 million Filipinos, according to the UNICEF and World Bank figures, who actually live in poverty. So that's one of the reasons why you have like drug addiction. It's because people's lives are immiserated. Also, it's not just the miserable poor who get addicted to drugs. Plenty of rich people do as well. They're also alienated. They're alienated in slightly different ways to the working class, but alienation works with them as well. But when coming back to the Filipino situation, you have a large number of very dirt poor people. You have a significant drug market amongst them. And you have to, when examining whether Duterte was right in terms of his methods worked, judge these things by the actual results that they get. And now, I would argue that the results of Duterte's crackdown would be, seem to have been, a temporary decline in drug consumption and selling of drugs, but that this, of course, would not last. And it wouldn't have lasted even if Duterte had got another term or if Marcos had carried on the same rather brutish methods. Because, again, you're not addressing the issue why Filipinos take a large amount of narcotics. And that comes from, again, like an immiserated life, social atomization, alienation, etc. Now, without the ability to address any of that, because no Filipino government actually wants to address any of those problems, then you're left with either do nothing or take the sledgehammer approach, which Duterte did. Now, given that he oversaw a decline in drug-related violence whilst he was in office, it's not a surprise that from all the way back to his time in Davao, he's actually had quite a high amount of public support. And so Duterte did want, I believe, to quite sincerely tackle the drug crisis in the Philippines, but of course he can't, because the creation of this crisis is down to the immiserating operations of the Filipino capitalism. So, to go back to the reason why Duterte ended up being arrested or indicted and then arrested by the ICC, well, the central reason why that is, again, it's stated that it's to do with the drug war, with extrajudicial executions, death squads, etc. It's really to do with the fact that Duterte tried to strike a balance between the US and the Chinese. Now, to the point where Duterte actually delayed the signing of something called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, ECDA. This was signed before he came into office in 2015, and Duterte sat on it and declined to ratify it for the entirety of his presidency. So as soon as he is gone and safely gone from the scene, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. ratifies this treaty. Now, what does this do? It gives the US personnel and US hired mercenaries, referred to as contractors, right to exercise complete control over 5 more military bases in the Philippines, in addition to the ones they already have personnel at. So it's a very even to what Duterte was standing in the way of was a more comprehensive domination of the country by US imperialism. That's what he ultimately was, partially at least, standing in the way of by refusing to ratify this ECDA treaty and by insisting or trying to insist on Filipino sovereignty. And this is why Duterte went back and forth between criticizing the US vehemently to criticizing the Chinese from time to time. But again, he has been indicted by the ICC and taken to trial in The Hague, not for anything to do with the drug war, but for it is everything to do with his refusal to ratify this ECDA treaty. And that is essentially why Duterte got arrested. And now, just to talk about what the ICC is, International Criminal Court, despite what it says on its website, it's not actually a UN body. It's one that exists outside of the framework of the United Nations. Now, its origins lie in the various ad hoc tribunals started by US imperialism in the 90s. The most prominent of these was the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. This was a prime example of what can only be described as victor's justice, which was set up mainly to go after those who defended the continued existence of Yugoslavia, hence why the greater majority of those put on trial were Serbs. The most prominent of these trials was that of former Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, which ended in embarrassment for the imperialists after Milosevic conducted a very successful defense of himself and also ended up embarrassing several witnesses on the stand with these sharp questioning, such as the idiot former General Wesley Clark. So the ICC comes from that period in the 1990s, where the US is looking for a way to actually make sure that they can have a court system at their beck and call, which can be used to address current or former heads of state and heads of government. Because if nothing else, it's a great disciplinary mechanism. If you have a court which basically will dance to your tune no matter what its indictment of Netanyahu says, or what them issuing an indictment against Netanyahu says. Now, the US was looking for a way to actually get hold of personnel from different state machines and put them on trial for crimes that they may have done, they may not have done, but which were always secondary in terms of the reason why the US insisted that some people had to go to a trial in The Hague and some people would never go there. Mainly, there would never be any chance of any American serviceman or woman being handed over to the ICC, and the same goes for the US's closest allies as well. They were all told to indulge the creation of the ICC because it was something that looked good. It was something that looked like America was signing up to international justice, etc., etc. You know, of course, the US imperialists have no intention of allowing any of their men, any of their personnel to be brought into this court and to be questioned about their own actions. And that's not something that they're into. They want everybody else to do it. So, like when the ICC indicted Putin on that faked child abduction indictment, you had many people cheering and crying along with the great the ICC. What a great institution of international justice that is. We should have more things like this. And you see it on demonstrations all the time. People screaming, "Why isn't Netanyahu in The Hague?" Well, I'll tell you the answer to that one. He's not in The Hague because it's not useful for US imperialism for him to be in The Hague. That's why. As long as he does the business for US imperialism in Israel, his head is safe. His neck is safe. I don't think they would ever dare put him on trial. He probably knows way too much about various different US administrations. So they might, if it came to it, he might find himself in an Epstein-type scenario. But the point being here that the US is never going to agree to the International Criminal Court actually having any real teeth to judge its allies or itself. It's only ever meant to be deployed against the US's enemies. Hence why Lindsey Graham and co. were delighted when the ICC issued an indictment against Putin, but of course were horrified when the ICC, facing a collapse in its credibility, had to issue an indictment against Netanyahu. So Duterte gets arrested recently following an indictment being issued against him, listing a series of charges relating to his time as mayor of Davao and as Filipino president. But he gets handed over by his successor, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who then turns around and what does he do? Well, he signs that ECDA. He signs that defense agreement with the United States, like a good boy, you know. He does what he's told. Now, he says he's trying to strike a balance between the US and the Chinese, but this isn't true. You don't hand over 5 additional bases to a country you're trying to strike a balance with. You hand over 5 additional bases because, well, you've been told to. And Ferdinand Marcos Jr. knows what his job is. His job is to obey the United States up to the point where the Philippines becomes a smoking pile of ash floating around in the Pacific Ocean, if it came to that. So, again, the reason why the ICC moved against Duterte isn't anything really to do with the drug war, isn't anything really to do with the number of people killed in that. That's just what they could find on him to use. He is really being arrested and taken out of the picture because he tried to insist upon not even siding with the Chinese, upon a more neutral, nuanced position. Remember how the US political establishment always talked about nuance? Well, they don't appreciate it in other countries. I doubt they even appreciate it in their own too much. So, what does this reveal? The fate of Duterte, who was in political terms a moderate. The man was no Marxist. The man's no communist. The man's not socialist. He's a bourgeois Filipino politician with Bonapartist tendencies who wanted to steer a more independent course. And for this, he has been arrested and will be imprisoned. So the ICC and the ability to hand over people to the ICC is a great disciplinary mechanism for the US. You can dangle it over people's heads. And if you're not from, so we say, a very powerful country like Russia or China, and if you're from the Philippines, if you're from Ecuador, if you're from, Kenya or Uganda or smaller African nations like that, then it will be something which you unfortunately have to worry about. Because, no one's going to arrest Putin. No one's going to arrest Xi. People might try and arrest Trump, but I doubt they'd be able to get away with it. But for smaller countries, when the big imperialist powers are saying, if you arrest this guy, if he comes on your territory, we'll give you anything you want. Again, this opens up threats to various different foreign leaders that the ICC is uniquely placed to deliver upon those threats, which is, again, why it's used, why it's backed tacitly by US imperialism. The arrest of Duterte is meant to send a signal to anybody who might dare step out of line, even in the smallest way that Duterte did. And this is why I say that the Filipino national liberation struggle must be renewed. The Filipinos fought a very brave and heroic struggle against the Spanish all the way back in the very latest part of the 19th century. But if there's going to be any movement forward, then the likes of Marcos and other comprador leaders have to be defeated, and the struggle for the national liberation of the Filipino nation and people must continue, inspired by the heroic struggles of their own past. And otherwise what you're going to get is just a series of comprador regimes headed by the likes of Marcos and anybody else the US can round up and stick in office. And again, to reiterate the point, the ICC is a court that was founded not to deliver international law or anything like that. It was founded to deliver victor's justice, or more specifically, to indict people and have people arrested, indicted, and jailed on the basis, or whatever basis that the US decides is politically convenient for them at the time. So this that's what the ICC is used for. That's why the US was so outraged when they issued when they indicted Netanyahu. Again, not that Netanyahu is ever going to see the ICC in a million years. So the point is that this is why Duterte has been arrested. This is why he will go on trial. And it has nothing to do with drugs. It has nothing to do with death squads. These are all just excuses that the human rights industry came up with. Duterte may be guilty of a number of crimes. He may be guilty of what they say he has been arrested for. But that is not why he has been arrested, and that is not why they will try to imprison him. Again, Duterte is being used as a scapegoat and a warning to others of what happens if you step out of line. Okay. Pausing there for questions, comments, etc. Okay. Just going back up to the top. Okay. Right. A lot of comments here. All right. So we got Michael Quinn, Spurious Furious, Comrade Davey, Zane Mudassir, who says hello. Sid says this should be interesting. I had occasion to make the online acquaintance of a number of Filipinos in 2021 and 2020. Right. Hello to Meme. Says at least the Filipinos used to war and martial law since the Spanish conquistadors. Sid says they're most likely to make an example out of him because he represents a faction of the Filipino compradors who are open to good relations with China. That's true. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Agricola Urbanus, good evening to you. Says major electricity blackout in Spain and Portugal. Yes, you know where you don't get that? Socialist countries. Well, you don't get that in the DPRK, for instance. The allegedly advanced West, it's happening more and more and more because the infrastructure is fucking crap. Almir says they want to use the Philippines as a proxy against China. They wouldn't be able to do that with Duterte as president. Yes, I think Duterte would have tried to block that. Marcos, no such considerations. His father sold the Philippines, out in a very public way, in a very horrific way that indebted them and beggared the nation. And this is how the US operates. They will use the Taiwanese as a proxy. This is why there's those protests in Taiwan right now involving protests against the Democratic People's Party, because they're trying to line the stooges in Taipei are trying to line up to get to be first meat into the grinder against the Chinese, and the Taiwanese, many of them aren't happy with that. I can only hope that they can overthrow the US puppets and begin negotiations with the Chinese for peaceful reunification, which is what the Chinese government has always wanted. The people who don't want peaceful reunification of Taiwan and China are the out-and-out compradors in Taipei and US imperialism. Throw in British imperialism there as well. Sid says it's been in the Philippines has been independent in name only since 1946. Almost immediately, CIA under Edward Lansdale was installing puppets like Mag Saysay. Indeed. Yes, the US, says Sid, went into the Philippines for the same reason they went into Cuba, to smash the revolution boiling up against the Spaniards. Yeah, they went in there to save imperialism, not to fight it. Mutanda says, so does this lead to getting shipped to The Hague, meaning we have we have hope that Israel will do the same to Netanyahu. I doubt it because Netanyahu knows too much dirt. Netanyahu will not be put on trial. He will die in his sleep. Now, whether that'll be a natural death or not, who knows? But he won't be seeing the inside of a jail cell. Unfortunately, you can make a pretty safe bet on that shit, you know? T.G. Wilson says, Chapter 4 of William Bloom's Killing Hope goes over the American imperialism in the Philippines. Good reference there. Read that book if you haven't done so already. Hello to Pablo Popova, Randy Terpstra. The key is to borrowing dollars, says Almir, then they got you by the throat, indeed. Agricola Urbana says, MacArthur was a fool. I won the Philippines campaign at first try in TOAW. Which one's that referred to? Which game is that referred to? MacArthur was asleep at the wheel probably because of imperial arrogance like the British in Malaya. Yeah, it's a good point. Like the British and the Americans, the British in particular, lost badly to the Japanese over and over and over again, despite having numerically superior forces in some instances, simply because the commanders were shite. Like the commanders of most of the British Army at the beginning of World War II were crap. They were career officers who'd made their careers shooting peasants in India or some of the or Rhodesia or South Africa, and didn't regard the Japanese as being capable of fighting. Japanese militarists had actually fought some more serious wars than the British, and so were actually better prepared for the war. And the British army was poorly organized, incredibly badly led, incredibly incompetently commanded, and it took them years to find halfway capable of commanders to put in charge. So the only reason you get like a Bernard Montgomery, for instance, is because he ultimately came up to be in a senior position and was found to be a man who was completely wild reactionary, but a talented battle commander. But it took a while for them to actually get some of those guys into position and to sort of clear out the old crap that had been hanging around and waging colonial campaigns for years. So yes, most of the American and particularly the British commanders were absolutely arrogant buffoons who lost the Japanese for well-deserved reasons as a result. Sid Atfield says, MacArthur was a fascist. I know that much, but every member of his general staff was an overt fascist, especially Charles Willoughby, a.k.a. Kurt Wiedenbach. I haven't read up on him. I know a little bit about MacArthur because of the Korean connection, but MacArthur was sacked by Truman for basically refusing to follow the orders of the president, which the military do all the time in the United States, and most militaries in the imperialist nations do. It's just that they don't say it. MacArthur's mistake was because he was I believe he was a 5-star general, which said the United States hasn't had that before or since MacArthur, as far as I know. And he had ruled Japan as a dictator, as a colonial governor, for years after World War II. And so 5-star general, unquestioned authority as colonial governor of occupied Japan, he thought he was bigger than the president. And also he wanted to nuke China, and due to the fact that he was losing the war. So in the end, even the US couldn't stand such arrogance and had to remove him. But the reason why I recall the name of MacArthur is a strange one. I had a collection of writings by that old lunatic Hunter S. Thompson, and he referenced like playing MacArthur's resignation speech that was, I believe, read out, or his final statement that was read out to Congress, I think. And that this was available on record. I don't know if any US viewers can confirm this, that this was available on vinyl. And Thompson writes that he had a copy of this and would get off his face and listen to it and laugh hysterically. Not sure if that's something that is true or not, whether that was just Thompson making shit up, whether the MacArthur resignation speech is available on vinyl or not. That'd be something to have. You'd think Americans would support a war against drugs, says Almir. Well, no. Look, war on drugs that are supported by the United States, or the British, by the way, is the same as a war on terror. So were the US and the British actually waging a war on Al-Qaeda? No. That was always just a pretext. Al-Qaeda always works for the British and the Americans, one way or the other. So, and the same with the war on drugs. The US and the British are the government, so the worst drug dealers, the most extensive drug dealing operations in the entire world are theirs, have been for a very long time. So why would they want a war against drugs? No. What they use war on drugs for domestically, I mean, Nixon's aide Ehrlichman admitted this, that it was a means for stitching up black radicals in particular and throwing them in prison on a drugs charge was a good way of doing that. Hence the old joke about, cops running around with the usual cop kit, holstered pistol on the side, under the armpit, handcuffs on the belt, second piece on the ankle, but then various bags full of like weed, coke, and heroin to plant on a suspect and say, hey, he's a drug dealer. Cops, good day out. So this is what war on drugs was used for domestically in the United States. It's what it is used for internationally as well. So why did the US pressure the Mexicans, particularly under Calderon, to do that war on drugs in Mexico? I mean, there's going to be a variety of reasons for it. My money is on the US wanted elements within the US state machine wanted to do something to actually destabilize the Mexican state. I think that is what they were ultimately after. Bear in mind, this war on drugs started just after Calderon won a very controversial and contested election against López Obrador. So some elements of destabilization of the Mexican state would appeal to the US, and particularly the more cynical elements in its intelligence agencies, who would think that by reducing Mexico to a state of perpetually blood-soaked violence, that it would be that it would stop any potential oppositional movements from garnering support if you would just reduce the whole country to chaos. My guess is that somebody made that calculation. That's why they pressured Calderon into declaring a war on drugs. Ultimately, they wanted chaos. Sid says Duterte probably envisioned himself as Southeast Asia's Erdogan. Yeah, I think that's what Duterte was definitely after. Duterte and Erdogan are sort of similar figures in certain respects, but that's Erdogan's game. Erdogan's game is that he's realized that there is, that the multipolar world is a reality, and that he, as the successor to the sultans of old, will position himself as the vital middleman. So that's what he that's his plan. I think that was Duterte's plan as well. What they didn't count on, what Duterte didn't count on, was that he wouldn't be successful in swapping himself out for his daughter, which is one thing he wanted to do. And the US, it would appear, has an even tighter grip on the Philippines than they have on Turkey. Good evening to Jenny, our moderator for this evening. Vera says, my daughter-in-law has a Filipino mother who adores Duterte, and according to her, most Filipinos have much respect for him. Yeah, it's not a surprise. I mean, when you have a situation where a country or a city is suffering from high degrees of criminality, and a bourgeois politician steps in and says, I can solve it. I'm going to need to do some rough stuff, but I can solve it. And then he steps in, he comes into office, does said rough stuff, and it starts to work. Well, this is going to be somewhat popular with a significant section of the population, because crime and chaos are something which afflict the working class in particular. It's why whenever there is an area of the world or an area of a country that is ridden with crime, if it's a working class area, the authorities don't really give a shit. But so when a politician emerges who claims that he does, and then looks as if he's done something to improve the situation, there's going to be a good degree of popularity that he's going to have. And Duterte was consistently popular in Davao and then in the wider Philippines. Marcos isn't. So this might be part of the reason why they chose to take Duterte out now. Despite the fact that he's 80 odd, there's every chance he might have tried to run again, or somebody from his clan would have run again. But they don't want that, shall we say, Erdogan-inspired approach. They want pure compradors. Sid says drugs are very useful for the bourgeois. Indeed, indeed. T.G. Wilson says Duterte's crackdown may have interrupted CIA drug running. Well, it may have done. I think the even if that was the case, I think it's not that's done this. I think it's the attempt to orient the Philippines in a more neutral fashion. That's what's done for Duterte. Okay. Hello to Balkan Tourist. Right. Almir says, how did China solve its opium issue after the revolution? Did they execute the dealers? I think a number of serious criminals were executed in the late 40s and early 50s. Quite a number, in actual fact. So the issue is, though, that the punishing crimes is only one particular piece of a much larger puzzle. So you need to, when building socialism, of course, you need to be asking yourself, well, how do we actually keep people away from narcotics? How do we do that? How do we make sure that drug taking doesn't return, or anything else like alcoholism doesn't return? And the answer is, of course, to minimize alienation. Antisocial behavior, addictions, all these things come from alienation and atomization. That's the root of these things. And if you can tackle the root of that, and more to the point, you can give people a feeling of meaning and purpose that goes beyond themselves and their own, well, for want of a better term, ego, and their own petty desires, then that'll help far more people get off the various different narcotics that they've been on than any number of bourgeois campaigns of either violence or imprisonment. Give people who've previously been suffering from addiction problems a combination of support and purpose and meaning in their lives, and a lot of them will leave behind their addictions if that is the case. So the Chinese would have combined executing the worst dealers with bringing as many layers of the population as possible into the building of socialism, into the building of the People's Republic. And that would have, and did, inspire a wave of hope through the proletariat and peasantry that did more to get people off drugs than just about anything else could do. Meme says they teach poor third world people to focus on their afterlife, so their current lives, indeed. Balkan Tourist says ICOC, International Court of Criminals. Yep. Callum Roche says, I thought it came out of the Nuremberg trials, didn't realise it was so new. No, it literally started, the ICC started 20 years ago. Rome Statute is only about 20 odd years old. And the way in which it was founded it was obvious what it was being used to do. It was being used to target enemies of the United States. And again, US never signed up to it. Never will. Because remember, when there was even talk of applying this to the US, I think it was John Bolton who said, yeah, you do that, we'll invade The Hague and take any US citizen that's arrested out of there. And you better believe that they would as well. Without they'd need to, though. They'd just need to pick up the phone to whichever clown is running the Netherlands at the moment and tell him, look, Jacob, give it up or we invade. And the Netherlands would roll over and play dead quicker than a dog performing for a pizza crust. Breaking news, says T.G. Wilson, a $60 million FA-18E Super Hornet on the USS Harry S. Truman aircraft carrier fell overboard and was lost to the Red Sea, the Navy announced on Monday. So basically that means that my guess is that either the USS Harry Truman collided with something to the point where, like, a bit of its runway was chopped off and a plane fell into the ocean, or the U.S. Navy has actually started losing aircraft to the forces, to the Yemeni forces, because falling over. I mean, it's eminently possible that the U.S. aircraft carrier crews are, drunk, out of it, incompetent, to the point where they literally drop a plane over the side of the ship. But I don't find that particularly likely. I mean, it's possible. My guess is that the Yemenis shot something down, and this is their way of saying, "Oh, not only is it gone, not only has it fallen overboard, but we can't possibly get it back. You can't see it." To me, that looks like it got shot down, and they are desperate not to admit it. Let's just scroll through some more comments here. Jenny says, "You're either a slave of Western imperialism or you will be destroyed." Good point. David King says, "Jailed like Imran Khan for disobeying the empire." Well, I mean, the Imran Khan thing is an interesting one, because in actual fact, like, Khan's successors haven't changed policies. Not really. I mean, there's an argument to say that that Khan was maybe closer to Russia than his successors are, but in terms of the big policy, which is the alignment with the Chinese, or the alliance with the Chinese, well, that has continued through successive Pakistani administrations, military and civilian, and continues to this day, which is part of the reason, I think, why the US is very happy to stir the pot when it comes to India-Pakistan conflict. And I think that the US would be delighted to see a war break out there, because it would inconvenience the Chinese and would offer the opportunity to further destabilize Iran. Bear in mind that it is highly likely that the US just staged a gigantic terrorist attack inside Iran, just like they staged one a few years ago, carried one out a few years ago in Lebanon. It's fairly clear to me that this was a deliberate act. So, but back to the Pakistan thing, the US would welcome, I think, the Pakistanis and the Indians going at it, because it would inconvenience China, and it would potentially derail Belt and Road Initiative projects. Because they've tried using Balochi insurgents, they've tried using all kinds of terrorists against the Chinese operating in Pakistan, who are actually working on programs that may stand a chance of further industrially developing Pakistan. Because God knows the Pakistani bourgeoisie ain't going to do it. So then this hasn't worked. So why not go for all-out war, or at least a limited war that will further destabilize Pakistan, potentially bringing some changes there that favor the US more. Because the Pakistani elite, I think, have started to go rogue quite some time ago. They started to pursue their own interests. I mean, Musharraf only went along with the US with a literal gun to his head over the invasion of Afghanistan, the occupation of Afghanistan, and also the so-called domestic war on terror in Pakistan, which led to thousands and thousands dying, which I will have to go back and do some research on and do a show on that, because it's a very interesting and horrific period in Pakistani history. So the Pakistani ruling class themselves, or at least a faction of them, seem to have got sick of the US and decided to pursue new opportunities. The new opportunity in question being an alliance with China, which, though it must be said that the Pakistani-Chinese cooperation goes back a long way, but them becoming increasingly economically entwined with Chinese and through Chinese projects is a relatively newer thing. But it would seem that the alignment of Pakistan is solidly with China now, even though there are still pro-American elements within the military and intelligence services. It would seem that the Chinese influence is strong there, which is what the what the US will be concerned with diminishing in any war that does break out. Right. Edward says Latvia's Foreign Minister Baiba Braz on the 18th of February 2025 declared that Russia had lost and Putin will be judged in the ICC. Well, the Baltic state madmen aren't good at predictions, it would seem. David King says Duterte said we will end up like Ukraine, then jail appeared. Yep, because Duterte is not stupid. And he can see where the likes of Marcos will lead the Philippines into hell, basically. I'm just going through here. See what we've got in terms of further comments. Balkan Tourist says the Sun and other gutter media channels saying Russia not ruled out of causing blackout from hacking. It's not a blackout from hacking, it's a decrepit, declining infrastructure. That's why you've got a power cut in Spain and Portugal. Agricola says Japan retains big influence among Taiwan elites. Well, that makes sense given it was a occupied Japanese territory for many, many years. Sid says, I was able to talk to a few middle-class Filipinos who are just as bad as one would figure. They hate the poor Filipinos and call them lazy, stupid scum, etc. Yep, there's your typical petty bourgeois. Doesn't matter whether he's from the Philippines or from Folkestone. It's the same attitude towards those who they regard as being below them in the social order. Edward says, what are your comments on the Filipino Maoist guerrillas? Also, USA saved imperialism in Guam and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba, not ended it. Well, yeah, I know that. But I don't know enough about the long-running Maoist insurgency in the Philippines. I think it's the New People's Army there. But I'll take it away and look at it, and I'll come back to it on the next Q&A, Edward. Tell you what, send me in your question via email, and I'll put it into next week's Q&A. Agricola says TOAW is the operational art of war, very good round-based strategy game with historic campaigns and accurate historic units like Stalingrad, Philippines, etc. Interesting. Balkan Tourist says the losers will celebrate Victory Day in Kiev. Will they? I suppose they're still pretending that Ukraine was, an independent actor in World War II. The winners will celebrate in Moscow. Very true. Almir says the best commanders in World War II were Soviet, Communist, Chinese, and unfortunately some Germans too. Probably true. Certainly, Mao's record as a military commander is neglected. I'll probably do a show on that at some point in the near future. Right. US is destabilizing Myanmar for the same drug trade, says Ogas Cybernetics. And indeed, you may well be right. Right. By World War II, British imperialism was in the final stage of degenerate finance monopoly capitalism. It had already sucked dry its colonies, even investing in the armed forces without a question. Says Jawad, yeah, they only got motivated to do it when they were literally faced with foreign invasion, and it looked like that this was a war they might lose and lose badly. So they had to be forced into doing it. And again, that was at a point where things looked degenerate in the 30s. My God, they're so much worse now. 44 countries to join BRICS this year, says Balkan Tourist. Very interesting point. Almir says Marcos family stole billions from what I heard. Well, that's the comprador's role. Steal billions, beggar the country, make off with what you can while you can, and make sure that the country remains tied to US imperialism. If you do that, you can retire with possibly many, many hundreds of millions, maybe billions to your name. The Zelensky option, shall we call it. Daniel Price says, is there even a national bourgeois in the Philippines? It seems like there are 100% compradors, all from the same dozen or so families who do nothing to develop the country and only extract rent. It's a good point from Daniel. I mean, there was like these, the revolutionaries in the Philippines in the 1890s were to a large extent like a bourgeois revolutionary group. And they were inspired by French Revolution, American Revolution, Garibaldi's Risorgimento, that kind of thing. So there was a bourgeois revolutionary nationalist element there. Whether there is any more is an interesting question. I haven't dived quite far enough into the state of the Filipino ruling class to see this, but I'm going to dive further into it. My instinct is that there may be, but I think the bulk of them, judging from the history, the great bulk of them are just literally like bottom of the barrel scumbags who would sell the country to the US for about $50 if they thought it was in their interest to do so. Dan Borhal says there is an ongoing revolutionary movement against US imperialism and the puppet government in the Philippines. Yes, very true. Alexander Lukter says 90% of sympathy even non-radical people feel for the Third Reich is for law and order. This would not have happened under the Fuhrer. Was a common sentiment. Barely anybody wants the anti-Semitism back. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Third Reich nostalgia is something that is again deliberately promoted by the bourgeois on the internet these days. Dan Borhal said, an armed revolution led by the Communist Party of the Philippines against US imperialism and its local puppet government is as a revolutionary army called New People's Army. Yes, indeed. Arcane Electric says, question, will you consider doing a show soon about Ibrahim Traoré and the latest coup attempt in Burkina Faso by the CIA and French intelligence? Yes, that's on the list, most definitely. David King says, Pakistani minister says Pakistan has been badly damaged by supporting USA and Britain a few days ago. Well, it's a correct judgment. I mean, what did Pakistan get out of? The Pakistani masses get out of their governments siding with the US? Nothing. I mean, even the Pakistani bourgeois probably got a bit of a payoff, but not by much. So, yeah, all that the alliance with the US and the British has given to Pakistan is debt and destruction. So it was perfectly rational for Pakistani decision makers who actually want to develop the country to look to an alliance with the Chinese. You're never going to get that kind of development out of the Americans or the British. Agricola Urbana says, Ali Bhutto, Ziaul-Haq steering off the path didn't end well for them. Even Zia was a good boy for the empire first. Yeah, there's been a lot of speculation that Ziaul-Haq was ultimately assassinated. Don't have enough information about it myself to make a judgment there. T.G. Wilson says Traoré has brought 1,000 excavators, graders, and other road construction machines and dropped previous tenders for road construction 100 times overpriced. Yeah, I mean, that's like a classic sort of neocolonial graft that he's broken up there. Almir says Chinese military participated in the victory parade in Vietnam, 50-year anniversary of the Vietnamese victory. Looks like the US won't be able to divide Vietnam and PRC. Well, the people who run Vietnam aren't stupid. I mean, yeah, they had that war against the PRC back in like 1980, but that's a long time ago. Chinese and the Vietnamese both know that it's in their interests to resolve whatever remaining territorial disputes that the Vietnamese and the Chinese have, and to do so amicably. So the fact that President Xi was over there, the fact that there's a Chinese contingent on the victory parade for the celebration of the liberation of what's now Ho Chi Minh City, all that points to the fact that the Vietnamese aren't going to be getting involved in any US action against the Chinese. I don't think that was ever on the cards. G.G. Wilson quotes the Pakistani defense minister who says, well, we have been doing this dirty work for the US for about 3 decades, and, for the West, including Britain. Yeah. Agricola Urbana says, I think electricity in Western Europe depends much more on French nuclear power now since German electricity production went down in 2022. Yep, the Spanish will have to reopen their coal mines just to power their generators. Sid Hatfield says Myanmar would make sense since the US has been ousted from Afghanistan. They need a new major opium producer. Very true. What do you expect? A huge influx into the CPGBML, asks Edward, party of the new working class cadre, or is it that's still decades away? Maybe Britain will become the new centre of world revolution if you guys succeed first. Well, let's hope so. But at the moment, what we're looking at is developing the party to the point where we can have a solid basis in every or as many working class communities as possible, and operational branches in as many working class communities as possible. A Communist Party's job at this stage is to bring what I would call the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism to the working class in as many different areas of the country as we can, to build up a solid cadre-based organization to ready ourselves for the intensification of the class struggle when it arrives. Now, at the moment, we're going to be recruiting like the advanced workers, mainly the advanced workers. Not going to communist parties, real communist parties at this stage aren't going to become mass organizations. It's about forging an unbreakable hard core of cadres, of working class cadres, who know how to communicate with the wider working class, who know how to organize amongst the class, who know how to get things done in their community, in their workplace. These are the people we'll be, I think, be recruiting in the next period, and that's what we'll be focusing on. You can't go from being a relatively small party to being a mass party without basically degenerating your organization. What we're doing now is we're trying to forge a party of Bolsheviks in the best sense of the term, a party of rock-solid Marxist-Leninists who know how to use and apply the dialectical method to analyze day-to-day problems, to take the line of the party into the class, test it, refine it, and test it again, and build our influence within the class via the recruitment of advanced workers. That's the task at this stage. Now, when the struggle moves on and the struggle intensifies, then you might be looking at an escalation in terms of like what your recruitment tactics are. But at the moment, it's about finding the advanced workers, recruiting them, and training them. Paul McCord says they were Freemasons. Which particular group that I've been talking about are you referring to there, comrade? Agricola says, I think Monty Python's Blackadder, and other satires in the British Army were there for a reason. Yeah, it's a cliche to say that the British officers are all like posh and absolutely fucking useless, but every truism has truth in it. Meme says all the American supercomputer servers are in the Philippines. I had heard that before. I'm not sure of the reality of it though. Sid says Philippines has a lot of internal ethnic divisions too, especially between those who speak Tagalog and those who speak Cebuano. So there's a lot to be played upon. Indeed. David King says Myanmar, USA target. And coup in Bangladesh. India also ripe for their divide to conquer agenda. Yeah, and also the Indian bourgeois are another bunch who I think want to position themselves as being directly between the blocks, between the imperialist bloc and the non-imperialist bloc. That's where I think the Indian bourgeois want to be making money off both. Um, so hence their ambivalent relationship to BRICS sometimes. Oh, Paul McCall says revolutionaries Jose Rizal and Bonifacio were Freemasons. That is often the case. Well, the Freemasonry back in the day did have a lot of bourgeois revolutionaries contained within its ranks. I mean, Freemasonry, well, we could do a whole show on Freemasonry, to be completely honest. The way in which it's changed over the years, I mean, there's a lot of Freemasonry which is bizarre and very dubious and has some incredibly strange elements to it. And has Freemasons in the United States and other institutions, organizations that spun out of Freemasonry have been involved in all kinds of weird and very deeply reactionary events. I believe it was the now retired podcaster Jimmy Fallon Gong who did like a series of programs on Freemasonry. So if you want an immediate deep dive into the secrets of the Freemasons, go and listen to that one. It's on the Program to Chill podcast, which is still available. Even though I think they're still releasing episodes, but certainly Jimmy Fallon Gong, I think, is retired from podcasting now. Alexander Lupta says, we had obligatory military service in Germany and they want to reintroduce it, but we are barely allowed to have a butter knife. What are they going to do? Parade around and point bananas at each other? I wish we had a party like the CPGBML, says Almir. Well, I don't know if there'll be anything out there. But maybe check the World Anti-Imperialist platform to see if there's anything. Excuse me. Anything operating in your country, because at least with the WAP parties, they are of a similar mind when it comes to analysing imperialism, even if there are differences between them when it comes to other things. Jawed says, comrades from Britain, please join CPGBML, and that is exactly the right point. I will now do a customary appeal, because if you're watching this in old perfidious Albion and you agree with the analysis here and you want to be educated, become educated in the science of Marxism-Leninism, learn how to use the dialectical method, and learn the truth about our own class's history and our own nation's history, then really there's no doubt there's only one party doing all of those things, and that's our party, CPGBML. So go along, check out the website. I will put it in the chat. Read through some of the articles there. If you like what you read, like what you see, then you should think about becoming a supporter of the party and help us build the organisation. The only party which are going to actually seriously attempt to build a revolutionary organisation that can be embedded in the working class. None of the rest of them give too much of a shit about that. Go to the website, read through the articles, take a look at the reading list, become a supporter of the party, and begin the process of genuinely liberating your mind from bourgeois crap. G.G. Wilson says, Program to Chill is a superb podcast. The series on Guatemala is brilliant. Indeed, indeed. Edward says, the more you realise how unique currently CPGBML is in Europe, the more you respect Comrade Harpal Bra. Immortal glory to him. Well, thanks, Edward. Yes, I mean, keeping the Marxist-Leninist tradition alive is something which is a few problems. Right, okay, there was a bit of an interruption there. Something fucked up on the Rumble Studio side of things. I'm not quite sure why. So if you're watching on YouTube or any of the other platforms, I apologize for the brief interruption there. But yes, like keeping the Marxist-Leninist tradition alive in an imperial core country in like the 90s and the 2000s was a tremendously difficult task, and one which took a great deal of determination and knowledge and very deep reading of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao to to understand the situation, to navigate your way through it, and to successfully overcome various attempts to destroy the party as well. There was an attempt to destroy the party waged by trans rights activists in 2018. The party was written off then, came back stronger. There was an attempt to destroy the party in the split with the Workers' Party, and that didn't work out very well either for those who wanted to destroy the party. Each time parties come back stronger. Now we're in a position where more and more people, more and more workers are being faced with the reality that there is no way of reforming the British system. There's no way of that parliamentarism has any answers. That reformism is a dead end, quite literally. The Labour left, the trade union leaders, all the traditional avenues of dissent are all absolutely fraudulent, dead in the water, going nowhere, and a revolution is the only option. The Trotskyism, again, is a fraud and a dead end. And so more and more people are being drawn towards us, which can only be a good thing. Sid says, I'm going to have to get active with our comrades here in the US. Well, good luck to you, Sid. Let us know how it goes. Callum says, I'm quite new to your podcast and party. Would you say you're broadly aligned with Domenico Lazzardo? Well, I'd say Lazzardo's work is very, very, very important for understanding the current situation. I mean, the more experience I have in terms of knowledge of imperialism, the more I appreciate Lazzardo's work in something like his work critiquing liberalism, his work on Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. It's a good book. I still find Grover Furr's work more useful because Furr's work is much more thoroughgoing. But Lazzardo's work on Stalin is excellent and very much worth everybody's time in reading. I think basically Lazzardo is a bit too soft on the anti-communists for my tastes, but I think it's very valuable work. So Lazzardo's legacy is huge and very important, and I haven't by any means read all of his work yet, but I'd encourage everybody to do so. Very important contributions that he's made. So what I would say to Callum, if you're in Britain, take a look through the website. You can see what the party's about there. Take a look at the reading list. And if you consider yourself to be a Marxist-Leninist or you're open to finding out about it, then you should become a party supporter and help us build our organization. Comrade Ian says, I found the CPG-BML via the World Anti-Imperialist Platform website, the only British party that has signed up. True, and the only one that ever will sign up as well. Okay, so, right, we are an hour and a half or so in, so I'm just going to do one more comment on this because so the developing story that's coming out of the war zone in the special military operation, the intervention by the DPRK into the special military operation, and this was something that came from the DPRK government. So this was not the Russians calling up the DPRK in a panic. It was the DPRK seeing, fulfilling their treaty obligations to their Russian allies, and also seeing an opportunity to gain military experience from going up against the Western Bloc, and the reports coming out of Russia and the reports emerging from the DPRK show that this was quite an extensive military contingent, it would seem, that went to Kursk, and that they performed incredibly well in their mission. So this is a very important development, that has been, again, like not exactly put in the headlines in the bourgeois press over here. In fact, they've mentioned it, but they haven't like done a victory lap about it. Mainly because the DPRK forces basically, to use an Americanism, clean the clocks of the NATO guys, and they probably don't really want to draw attention to that anymore. Them and their Russian allies destroyed the best army that the NATO forces could put together. Right. And the DPRK fighters praised by the Russians and indeed some Ukrainians for their bravery and selflessness and their commitment to their task. Right. Arcane Eclectic says China has special forces being trained in Russia too. They didn't want to miss out on the party. Yeah, indeed. Okay. So, Mushkin says, just started Lazardo's War and Revolution, coming off 2 months of insomnia. Not sure how much is going in. Well, if you want to cure your insomnia, best thing to do is to pick up a book by Paul Mason. You'll be asleep in seconds, possibly comatose. So, here we go. China has special forces training in Russia now too. They didn't want to miss out on the party. Very true, Arcane Eclectic. So, going to bring things to a close now for this evening. Thanks to everybody who's joined us. We have 153 of you on YouTube. I'm just going to look up the amount of you who are watching on X right now. Just give me a moment. So we have 214 of you watching on X. Excellent stuff there. Thank you very much. So thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. But until then, thanks for tuning in. See you again soon.